Houston, Texas just got absolutely obliterated by a hurricane. In fact, Hurricane Beryl barreled through Houston, Texas, leaving over 3 million people without power.
Millions still without power and a long road of recovery ahead.
Causing flooding, trees were down, and we don't know when power is gonna come back on. And so for those of you that have been thinking about moving to Houston, Texas, that are concerned about hurricanes, I wanted to show you exactly what happens here in Houston, Texas when we do get hit with a hurricane. See, I've lived here my entire life and I can actually remember growing up through multiple hurricanes, some of the worst of which were Hurricane Ike as well as Hurricane Harvey, which was a once in a lifetime storm. But here we are just 24 hours on the backside of a hurricane, and yet I'm still able to film this video for you. And so I wanna walk you through today exactly what it's like living in Houston, Texas through hurricanes so that you can see if it is worth it to you to actually put up with this for all of the other benefits that come from living here in the Houston, Texas. And there's really a couple main concerns when it comes down to hurricanes. During hurricane season, which lasts typically from around May until September here in Houston, we'll start getting rumblings of storms out in the Gulf, and we'll know about them well in advance, but a lot of times it's a lot of hype and they end up turning east towards Louisiana and head off over to Florida. But in this case, we got a direct hit here on Houston. We had a Category 1 hurricane make landfall just south of Galveston, Texas, near Port O'Connor. And what that means is that we actually got hit with the dirty side of the storm here in Houston, Texas. You see, our hurricane actually spins counterclockwise, and so the right side of the eye of the storm is going to produce those real strong hurricane winds. It can also cause tornadoes, and that's really what does the bulk of the damage during hurricanes. Now, when you look back historically at the hurricanes that have hit the Texas coast, they all impact Houston a little bit differently. Some of them bring tremendous rainfall. See, Hurricane Harvey wasn't devastating because of the wind damage or because trees were down, and it wasn't really necessarily due to power outages. It was really bad because when the hurricane hit land, it didn't go anywhere. It hung out over Houston, Texas, and it rained for something like 8 days, and that's what caused significant flooding. But here we are just 24 hours on the backside of Hurricane Beryl, and I've spent the time driving around to assess the damage, at least here on the north side of Houston. And yes, we have some flooding, but flooding wasn't the worst damage that I saw as I drove around. What I saw, oddly enough, was a lot of trees down. There are tons of pine trees here on the north side of Houston, and oftentimes that's the thing that our clients fall in love with when they are looking to move here. You see, we have established pine trees up here on the north side of Houston, starting over in Tomball over on the west side and heading all the way east over to the Kingwood area and pushing its way north up into the National Forest. And so where we're located right here in Conroe, Texas, you've got gorgeous pine trees, and my neighborhood got wiped out. See, pine trees are tall. Some of them can be 80, even 100 feet tall. And so when it comes to being affected by these hurricanes, typically the winds up here on the north side of Houston actually don't get too high. Obviously, if you're right on the coast, if you're living down in Galveston, or you buy a beach house, or you're anywhere on the south side of Houston, those hurricane winds come right out of the Gulf and they hit you with a ton of fury. But by the time you get 80, 90, even 100 miles inland, those winds typically die down enough where they don't cause a ton of damage. As I drove around, I didn't notice a ton of roof damage outside of the roofs that were actually impacted or impaled with fallen trees. Now, I can actually speak from experience. Having a tree fall on your house is not fun. About 1.5 years ago, we had a 100-foot pine tree fall on our house while my wife was in the living room, and it was scary to say the least. Now, fortunately for us, everybody was okay, and the damage was actually surprisingly minimal considering how big this tree was. But when we're talking about these hurricanes and whether or not it's something you need to be afraid of, one thing to consider is trees. Do you have any trees that need to be removed that could fall on your home? Now, I personally am a huge fan of these trees, and I don't like ripping them out. And so these trees have lived through multiple hurricanes oftentimes because they're 70, 80 years old in order to be this big. And so they got a pretty high likelihood of making it through even the worst storms. In fact, most of them did, but it's not to say that one of them can't fall on your house. And so the first thing to be concerned with are trees. So if you live anywhere in the Houston area, outside of the north side, you might not have as many issues when it comes to the threat of trees falling on your home. And that's something that if you're just really that worried about, you can control when you're purchasing here in the Houston area. You can completely eliminate that threat when it comes to hurricanes. Now, flooding is another issue, and flooding isn't something that we just get here in the Houston area during hurricanes. Sure, hurricanes bring in a lot of water, and depending on how long the hurricane hovers over Houston can determine the amount of flooding risk that we are actually at. But Flooding happens to be something that we have to deal with regardless of hurricanes here in the Houston area, and it's actually very easy to avoid. See, when you work with us, one of the first things we're gonna do when we're looking at homes for you is make sure they're not in an area that floods, and that starts with just insider knowledge from growing up here. I can tell you, without having to even look up flood maps, whether or not a place floods. But all of our agents have access to flood maps, which show us the predictability and the likelihood of different areas flooding. We've got flood zones, we've got the 500-year flood zone and the 100-year flood zone. And those maps will tell us whether or not a house has a chance of flooding. Now, once again, we can always look back to Hurricane Harvey, which devastated the city of Houston, and it devastated it because we got so much water. And this hurricane that we just experienced yesterday was not like that. There's some flooding down here in the Houston area, but it's nothing like what we saw during Hurricane Harvey. Now, most of the issues that we're seeing right now, as I mentioned, have to do with downed trees. It also has to do with power outages. See, currently while we're filming this, we happen to have power up at our office, which is great. And I actually never lost power at my house, which I'm gonna tell you in just a second how you can avoid losing power altogether here in the Houston area. But before we do that, I do wanna tell you, a lot of people are without power. So there's over 3 million people here in the city of Houston without power currently. And guess what? Hurricane season happens to be while it's really hot out. It is not a good time of year for a hurricane to wipe out our power. See, we rely heavily on air conditioner systems here for about 5 months in Texas to cool us off and keep us from dying of that Texas heat. And even a day after the hurricane, it is bright and sunny outside and it's getting all the way back up to 90 degrees. And it's been a scorcher. We're in July right now, and we've seen temperatures consistently around 100 degrees with sunshine. And so when you're talking about losing power for a day, it's really not a big issue. Your food starts to go bad. People are using backup generators that they're plugging into their refrigerators too, or they're getting ice from the gas stations, the grocery stores. But once you lose power for more than a day or two, that's when you start running into issues because you can't stay in your house. It starts to get too hot here. And so you're going to need to come up with alternatives in order to go and stay with people that have power. Now, there's really no rhyme or reason as to which areas keep power during hurricanes here. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me, so much so that my mother and my mother-in-law all live in the same exact neighborhood that I do. And my mother is without power while my mother-in-law and our house maintained power throughout the storm. And when you look at the Energy website to see the map of power outages, it honestly makes no sense. It's a complete scatter plot. Some people lose power, some people don't, and it could literally be one street over from another. Now, that being said, if you lose power, chances are it's gonna be out for a while because a lot of our power here in the Houston area is above ground power lines, and they got knocked out by trees. And so quite literally, they have to make those connections again in order to get electricity through all the different parts of the grid. Now, in our neighborhood specifically, in a lot of the master plan communities, you actually have buried electrical underground, which is great. Not only is it much more appealing and it's prettier, but it's not susceptible to trees falling on the power lines, except for the fact that in order to get power to the actual neighborhood, they're running them through power lines. And so you could have buried electrical in your neighborhood and still lose power because the power lines that run to the neighborhood get hit by a tree. Or possibly even something at the power plant goes wrong during one of these storms. And so power outages can suck. I remember growing up here during Hurricane Ike, we lost power for about 7 days. And here's what I'll say about that. As an adult, it sucks. As a kid, you actually don't know much better. I remember going out and basically we all just played outside with our friends for 7 days. We had nothing to do. Phones didn't really work. We didn't have power at the house. And we made the most of it. And that's what I'm trying to do as a parent now with my kids. And I've seen a lot of friends posting to Facebook saying that they're having fun with their kids, playing cards, having game nights underneath the lights. And so you can definitely make the most of it. Is it ideal? No. And does my heart go out to all of those that are affected? Absolutely. Let me be super clear. What I'm not trying to do is sugarcoat those that are affected by this storm. But what I do want to do is tell you the honest truth about how you are and aren't affected here in Houston, and also how you can avoid being affected. Because as I mentioned, you can actually choose to buy a home that doesn't have 100-foot pine trees next to it. Now, I still default to buying that. In fact, I have huge pine trees right behind my house that I was watching during the entire storm bend over like fishing rods. And I was just waiting for another tree to fall on our house. And it was kind of scary. But it's a price that I'm willing to risk and pay because I just love them. I love the trees. Now, another thing that you can completely mitigate and avoid, we mentioned, was flooding. I don't live in a floodplain. My house will never flood. If my house floods, then Noah's Ark is going to be a necessity, okay? We know where it floods and where it doesn't flood, and just because a hurricane hits doesn't mean that places that have never flooded before are magically going to flood. It's just not how water and gravity work, and that's tough to explain to some clients, but it's science. It just works. I didn't mean to make that rhyme, but it sounded pretty cool. So anyways, let's talk about the power outages and how you can avoid that altogether. Now, for our 6 years of living in the neighborhood that we currently live, for the first 4 years of the 6 living here, we didn't really deal with losing power. And then we started to have just the occasional 1-hour power outage during a storm. And it only took one time of losing power for 4 hours when it was really hot and we had 2 babies in the house that my wife said, hey, we're gonna get a generator. And I was like, are we really gonna spend that kind of money for, 1 hour, once a year kind of power outage situation? And she said, yes. And at first I thought this was absolutely unnecessary until your power goes out. And it goes out for about 60 seconds and you wait and then it kicks up and your power's back on, your TV's back on, your Wi-Fi kicks back on, you can do your laundry all over again. And in that moment, you will thank me for encouraging you to get a generator, because no matter what happens, whether the power comes back on after an hour or it doesn't come on for 7 days, it's literally like it never went out at all. And obviously, not everybody can afford a home generator, but if you're thinking about moving here to Texas and part of your move is centered around saving some money and the housing affordability and all the other benefits of living here, you might just want to go ahead and budget in for a generator. You can get a brand new Generac home generator installed into your house, anywhere from about $12,000 up to $15,000. And I could get way in the weeds of who to use and where to go for that. But just for reference, we spent around $13,000 and we have a 3,600 square foot home, and our generator will power our entire house. It'll power both of our AC units. We can watch all the TVs, have all the lights on, and even allow our neighbors to plug extension cords into our front porch to get power if they need it. And so it's definitely something that you can plan for, and ultimately is a great peace of mind, especially during storms like this. And so obviously there are some shortages when storms like this hit. If it takes everybody a day or two to get back on their feet, it's really not a big deal. But if people are without power for 7, 8, 10, 12 days, that's when you're gonna start seeing lines around the corner at the gas stations, people filling up their cars so that they can actually leave town. The gas station's running out of gasoline because there's a run on the pumps. And so quite literally outside of our office, we're next to a gas station and there's a line around the corner for gas. But guys, this is all avoidable. At 9 p.m. the night before the storm, put the kiddos to bed, said, hey babe, I'm gonna go fill up the cars with gas. Went and did that, took me 5 minutes. Glad I did. I can go 450 miles with each vehicle. Don't have to worry about that. Once again, something that you can plan for. I would say this isn't your first rodeo if you've lived here before, but it's not your first hurricane. If you lived here before, you just know what to do. I've lived here my whole life. If you're asking yourself the question, hey, how bad is it really? Well, look, it really depends on how you're affected. But if you haven't purchased a home here yet, there are a lot of things that you can avoid. You can, as I mentioned, pick a home that doesn't have huge trees towering over it. And if you do, that's just a risk you're willing to take. And I'll tell you what, there are amazing tree services and roofing companies that'll come out, and they've already in 24 hours cleared all of the roadways. They've started to pull the tree branches off of the homes. The rain's gone. There's not a ton of water damage, and they're already starting to patch, fix, and repair these homes. Now, obviously, that's not without a cost, and sure, it sucks to go through that, but at the end of the day, it's not something that people in Houston aren't used to and that we're ill prepared for. It's something that people respond really quickly to. We've got lists of really good trades. So if a tree does fall in your house, we got you covered. Secondly, flooding. We're gonna be super proactive about making sure you don't buy a home that floods in general, unless you're just absolutely wanting what you perceive as the best bargain in your life, which you're gonna pay at some point for in the form of a flood if you buy in a flood zone. And then last but not least is really the power outage. And that can be completely avoided, as I mentioned, by going ahead and purchasing an at-home generator. If you decide that that's too costly for you, at the minimum, you can go just buy a generator for a couple $100 that'll power up your refrigerator and give you food and maybe a light. Or you can go on a vacation and leave town for a week. I do remember growing up for one of the hurricanes, we just went to San Antonio. We went to SeaWorld for a week and came back and everything was, perfectly fine. So if you're worried about hurricanes and you're thinking about moving to Houston, I just wanted to show you exactly what it's like. Obviously, we went around, we got tons of footage of, how bad it actually was. But at the end of the day, it's not something that I actively, consciously think about. I completely forget that we even have hurricane season here. I'll get a notification on my phone, usually a couple days or a week out, that maybe there's something going on in the Gulf. Usually I hear from friends, people are talking about it. And then before you know it, you just say, okay, there's gonna be a hurricane here in 2 days. Fill up your car with gas, decide whether or not you want to stick around in town. If not, hit the roads, well before the day before, and just be prepared for it. And the coolest part is, Texas is the friendship state. In fact, I was doing a little research and realized that Texas actually originates from a Caddo word that actually means friends. And that is so evident after a hurricane or after a natural disaster here in Houston. Just going through these natural disasters shows, what the people of Texas are really made of. And maybe one of the reasons you're interested in moving to Houston is because you like that friendliness and you've experienced it. Well, I can certainly tell you that is something that's offered here. So sure, you might have to go through a storm every 5 or 6 years, but in the scheme of things, it's worth having those neighbors by your side every single day here in the Houston area. So if you have more questions about hurricanes, leave them in the comments below. I'm curious your experiences. And once again, just to reiterate, I'm not belittling the damage that actually took place here. These are real storms that affect real people's lives. But I think with a little bit of preparation, you can eliminate about 90% of the actual risk that we face here when it comes to hurricanes here in the Houston, Texas area. So once again, my name is Kyler Ferris. If you're thinking about moving here, our team does this. We get calls, texts, emails every single day from people just like you thinking of moving here. And if you're wanting to know more about the areas, be sure to check out some of our other videos. We will tell you everything you need to know about moving here to Houston, Texas. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.